As they got into their cars, Gorbachev said, "I don't know what else I could have done." And Reagan responded, "I do. You could have said yes." So 11 giddy, intoxicating hours ends in really bitter recrimination.
Hello and welcome to the Creating History podcast and our series exploring pivotal summit meetings where leaders, strategy and history collide on the world stage. I'm Russell Barnes, producer of television documentaries and now podcasts.
And I'm David Reynolds, author and historian.
In this, our second episode on the Summitry of the late 1980s, we explore American President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev's bold and imaginative personal diplomacy and its role in ending the Cold War peacefully. David, in the last episode, we discussed how Reagan and Gorbachev first met in Geneva in 1985, and against the odds and despite some tetchy exchanges, they broke the ice and began to develop a personal relationship.
Yes. On Lake Geneva, superpower relations began to thaw. The rapport between those two leaders was absolutely clear in front of the world's TV cameras. That started to shift the public mood and build confidence between East and West. But Geneva was just a starting point because there'd been no real breakthroughs there. So the two leaders agreed Geneva mustn't be a one-off summit. They wanted to plan summits for the future. But the problem was that back in Moscow, Gorbachev faced criticisms from old guard politicians about his lack of achievements at Geneva, so he was unwilling to go to Washington unless Reagan had promised an arms control agreement that included the Soviets' absolute bugaboo, the American Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, space-based missile defense against nuclear attack. But Reagan, who had his own problems in Washington, wouldn't give up on research into weapons in space. And he was beginning to lose confidence in Gorbachev as time went on, because it seemed that Gorbachev was backing away from his pledge to maintain dialogue through a visit to Washington.
So all those good vibes were beginning to fade.
Yeah, and what's more, without strong impetus from the top, the various working groups of diplomats that were set up at Geneva failed to get moving. They needed a kick up the backside and they weren't getting it. Arms control in particular remained in the hands of conservatives on both sides who were set in their positions.
So, deadlock again. What shifted things?
Well, to be blunt, a nuclear disaster. The explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear reactor in Ukraine in April 1986 exposed in an absolutely dramatic way the secrecy and inefficiency of Soviet bureaucracy. And also, to the public around the world, it demonstrated the appalling dangers of what would happen if there was a nuclear discharge. As the fallout from Chernobyl spread across Europe, Gorbachev, deeply chastened and really furious with his bureaucracy, embarked on a much more radical reform with new slogans, glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring. He really was moving up a gear. And then, in summer 1986, Gorbachev's encouraged in his diplomacy by former American President Richard Nixon.
A visitor from an earlier episode. What advice did he give?
Well, Nixon insisted to Gorbachev that Reagan was sincere about peace, and he also emphasized a really important political point, namely that Reagan, being a conservative and a Republican, he could, unlike a Democrat president, make an agreement stick politically. Remember, that's how Nixon, the old commie basher, could bring off deals with Beijing and Moscow, because a man like him couldn't be outflanked from the right. So, on holiday in August 1986 on the Black Sea, Gorbachev mulls over all these questions. He mulls over current negotiating proposals, frustrated that the two sides were just stuck in details. They weren't thinking big. He'd got time on a vacation to kind of think big and not get immersed in the details. So in September, he sends Reagan a letter suggesting they had to intervene personally in the process again to get things started. And he suggested they meet at a neutral halfway point between them, in this case, Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland.
So in October 1986, Reagan and Gorbachev do meet again, this time at Höfði House, which was a rather unassuming Icelandic government conference centre. At this stage, though, this wasn't supposed to be a full-blown summit. It was billed as a preparatory meeting to lay groundwork for the next big summit in Washington.
Yeah, well, that was how it was presented. But Gorbachev had other plans. His reforms, which had not been really clearly thought out by him, were starting to loosen not merely communist despotism, but also his own powers as leader. So he needed success and fast. And his strategy at Reykjavik was to take a risk and try to sweep Reagan off his feet, as he put it, in order to cut through the bureaucratic logjam lower down. That wasn't what Reagan and his advisors expected from the meetings, because they still thought that Reagan was going to have a hard time, as they put it, smoking Gorbachev out.
And what was Reagan hoping to get from this second meeting?
Well, I think you have to recognise there's a much shorter lead time, and so Reagan hadn't really prepared for Reykjavik with the same care that he did for Geneva. American conservatives were warning about a Soviet trap. Reagan kept promising that he wouldn't let the talks focus disproportionately on arms control, that he would raise human rights and other issues. But when he tried to do that at the opening one-on-one meeting between the two leaders, with only their interpreters present, Gorbachev outlined his own bold proposal. He stuck to the arms control issues and he suggested much deeper cuts. He said 50% reduction in strategic nuclear weapons. So Reagan agreed. Working groups were set up on the spot in this cramped little guest house. The Americans were frankly, I think, thrown by the speed of the discussions. They were also frustrated by the fact that the facilities were really pretty rudimentary. There was a real lack of photocopiers and computers at the Höfði House. At times they had to circulate proposals with the help of carbon paper donated by the Soviets. And some of the small meetings between the Americans and the Russians took place in whatever cubbyhole they could find, even in some cases in a bathroom with people standing in the bath to get the necessary room.
It sounds like the tempo of talks was being driven by Gorbachev's impatience for a breakthrough.
Yes, it was. And the whole thing was really intense. There were also, unlike Geneva, no plenary sessions at Reykjavik to hold the leaders in check. Those plenary sessions with all their own teams enabled things to just sort of slow down and get recalibrated. So there was this real sense of momentum gathering. By 5:30 p.m. on the second day, that's the 12th of October, with the two leaders going back and forth, refining their proposals, the two sides had come up with a dramatic arms control package. They were now talking about the elimination of all strategic ballistic missiles within 10 years.
That's an astonishing idea, and one that would have completely reshaped the global balance of power.
Yeah, though of course remember the United States still had a huge superiority in strategic bombers. So this was a shrewd negotiating ploy for the Washington Hawks like Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger. But at this moment, Reagan actually went further than that proposal about eliminating all strategic ballistic missiles within 10 years. And he said, it would be fine for me if we eliminated all nuclear weapons. So that's covering all the kinds of nuclear weapons, not just missiles, but battlefield nuclear weapons and so on. Gorbachev agrees, and Schultz says, let's do it.
Wow. The elimination of all nuclear weapons was a concept that would have been unthinkable just a few hours earlier, let alone a few years. This was Summitry at its most dramatic, almost unhinged.
Yes, I think both leaders got carried away by schemes for radical disarmament in that hothouse environment, and their high hopes proved illusory.
What changed things?
Well, the sticking point was, as usual, SDI. Gorbachev insisted that any agreement on all these types of nuclear weapons had to include strict limits on SDI research, confining it to laboratories. And that was a key phrase, laboratories. Reagan just refused to budge on this matter. He saw SDI as a non-negotiable part of his defense strategy. He exclaimed that Gorbachev was going to throw everything away for one word, as he kept saying. Gorbachev replies that this is a matter of principle for his country. He would be called an idiot if he went back to Moscow without an agreement on restricting SDI. And he says, in a sort of summing up a sentence or two, he says, "I have a clear conscience before my people and before you. I have done everything I could."
And that was it?
Well, not quite. The Soviet minutes of the meeting record Reagan as saying, in response to Gorbachev, "It's too bad to part this way. We were so close to an agreement." And Gorbachev replies, according to those minutes, "I wanted an agreement and I did everything I could, if not more." And in his memoirs, Reagan wrote that as they got into their cars, Gorbachev said, "I don't know what else I could have done." And Reagan responded, "I do. You could have said yes." So 11 giddy, intoxicating hours ends in really bitter recrimination.
When Gareth was 14, he was in a relationship with an attractive young teacher at his school, and he thought he was the luckiest boy in the world. But when she walked out of his life, everything started to unravel. 35 years later, everyone's acting like it never happened, and Gareth wants to understand why.
How about the truth? How about we do that first and then we work out where we're going to go from there? How about the truth?
This new 4-part series is about who gets to be a perpetrator and a victim. To listen, just search for Lucky Boy wherever you get your podcasts.
You know him as a British bulldog and World War II hero, but who was the real Winston Churchill? New history podcast Creating Churchill explores the man behind the myth, how Churchill's life and legacy were shaped by relationships with tricky allies like Roosevelt and Stalin, enemies including Hitler and Gandhi, and his wife and most devoted critic, Clemmy. With fresh psychological insight and untold stories, Creating Churchill, available now on your favourite podcast app.
So they come so close to achieving something historic, only to walk away again empty-handed.
Yeah, Reykjavik was seen as a failure at the time, and there were a huge blame game. But both Reagan and Gorbachev had shown they were willing to think big. And I think, it's strange to say it, but in a way, the emotional outbursts had exposed their real characters and created a deeper level of trust. Freed from the grip of their advisors in plenary sessions, Gorbachev and Reagan were able to let their anti-nuclear radicalism take hold. And after the emotions had cooled and in the wake of Reykjavik, they could both see how far the other had moved and how radically he could think. So it's striking now that Gorbachev no longer sort of sneers periodically about the president as a fool and a clown. And Reagan is confirmed in that hunch he had at Geneva that the human Gorbachev would win out over that confirmed Leninist. And each could now see more clearly, more profoundly, the would-be peacemaker in the other.
So both Reagan and Gorbachev didn't want to let the momentum die, and in private, the diplomats carried on talking.
Yes, and this is crucial, I think. They did. They were the people who were kind of stitching things up and restitching things when things got strange in public. Behind the scenes, they were doing that. Soviet Foreign Minister Eduard Shevardnadze joked that he and his counterpart, Secretary of State George Shultz, had lost count of the number of meetings they'd had one-on-one. They guessed maybe 35 or 37 meetings. And that's why I think the Geneva summit, what we talked about last time, was so significant. Its success lay not just in starting a relationship between the men at the top, but in facilitating that constant dialogue between their advisors. It's also worth remembering, and this is a side issue, but it's important, I think, Schultz had introduced Shevardnadze to simultaneous translation. That was a practice regularly used at the United Nations and in Western diplomatic meetings, but it hadn't been used for Soviet-American summits. Schultz tried it out at one of the bilateral meetings that he had with Shevardnadze. And when Shevardnadze went through that, at the end of it, he sort of beamed with delight, and he said to Schultz, "We got 8 hours work done in 4. And from then on, simultaneous translation was used for all plenary meetings at Geneva and subsequent Reagan-Gorbachev summits, though it's also important to say that consecutive translation was still the rule for talks between the two leaders.
And why did they keep it for the leaders?
Well, I think because it added a level of precision, and also maybe the sort of stately sort of tennis match involved gave leaders time to think. So, remember, this is like Reagan speaks, Russian interpreter translates into Russian, Gorbachev replies, American interpreter translates into English. That allows the leaders to think, and I think that's part of why they carried it on. But certainly at the plenary sessions involving all the teams as well as the leaders, simultaneous translation became the order of business.
Yeah. Anyway, back to the behind-the-scenes work by Shevardnadze and Schultz. That set the stage then for Gorbachev's visit to Washington.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And by the time Gorbachev arrives in December 1987, I think there's 2 other factors, if you like, that are helping to open up and loosen up the dialogue. The first is that Star Wars is becoming less of an obstacle. And that's because of the nature of American politics, separation of powers and different elections for the Congress and the presidency. The Democrats gained control of Congress in November 1986 in the midterm elections, and that makes it unlikely that the SDI Missile Defense Initiative would be voted at the necessary funding to get it off the ground. And the other point is that Reagan's credibility was severely damaged by news that his administration had sold weapons to Iran to help finance aid to Central American anti-communists. Remember, Iran was a regime run by fundamentalist Islamic clerics that had made American citizens hostage at the beginning of that decade, notoriously for the humiliation of Jimmy Carter, and also that this backstage deal about the Contras, as they were known, the Contra guerrillas in Central America, was actually a real financial scandal. It was corrupt as well as diplomatically problematic. So the president now needs Gorbachev. He really needs Gorbachev to come to Washington because the good PR of a summit was a chance to boost his flagging domestic reputation.
Well, let's talk about Gorbachev's arrival in Washington. This wasn't just any state visit. It was a moment of high drama and unexpected warmth.
Yes, absolutely. It was an amazing sort of scene. Imagine, Gorbachev's motorcade rolls into DC. There's thousands of people lining the streets to catch a glimpse of the Soviet leader. I mean, he's now a real international celebrity. There's people chanting, "Gorby, Gorby, Gorby," something that would have been unimaginable a few years earlier. So this is the height of Gorby mania, or as some disenchanted Republicans put it, it was a Gorbasm.
And then there was the famous moment when Gorbachev stopped his car before arriving at the White House so he could get out and shake hands with onlookers. And that was a gesture that no Soviet leader had ever made before.
Yeah, more like a film star gesture. It set the public tone for the entire visit. But as with the most effective summits, the key business that was going to be discussed at Washington had been hammered out behind the scenes by diplomats. So this isn't going to be some impromptu thing that gets out of hand like Reykjavik. The details of a new treaty had been carefully set out. This called for the elimination of an entire class of weapons, intermediate nuclear forces, INF, with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometres.
So at last, a move from symbolic agreement to something more concrete.
Yes, that's right. More concrete and much less grandiose and speculative than the kind of things that were talked about at Reykjavik. The treaty calls for the destruction of more than 2,600 missiles, and roughly two-thirds of those were Soviets. It only affected maybe 5% of the superpowers' arsenals, but it did include the cruise, Pershing and SS-20 missiles that had brought Europe close to war in 1983. Equally important, the treaty also includes unprecedented verification measures, and that includes things like on-site inspection. For the first time, each side would have the right to send inspectors to the other side's territory to ensure that they were complying with the treaty.
So a very positive step forward.
Yeah, it's a turning point in the Cold War. For the first time, the US and the Soviet Union weren't just limiting the arms race, they were actually reversing it. And they showed an unprecedented degree of mutual openness.
So by 1988, the relationship between Reagan and Gorbachev had evolved dramatically. The INF Treaty had been signed, and both leaders remained committed to further reducing tensions. And now it was Reagan's turn to visit Moscow.
Yes, a more comprehensive arms treaty was not yet ready to sign because of conservative opposition in Washington, and in fact it would only be ready in 1991. But in Moscow, Reagan and Gorbachev did sign deals on cultural and scientific exchanges, and also this was Reagan's first trip to the Soviet Union, so it was a visit packed with symbolism about how the Cold War was actually thawing.
And one of the first stops was a wreath-laying ceremony at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier by the Kremlin Wall.
Yes, a solemn moment, acknowledging that the Soviets had been allies in the Second World War, and also sending a powerful message that Reagan was there not just as an adversary who was now changing his ways, but almost as a partner for peace.
And a personal highlight for Reagan was his speech at Moscow State University, which was Gorbachev's alma mater.
Yeah, so Reagan delivers a speech about the power of freedom and innovation and the potential for a new era of cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union. Now, the whole speech couldn't be shown on Soviet television, but snippets were, and that was enough to help soften Reagan's image in the eyes of ordinary Russians who, remember, hadn't seen very much of the summits that were, of course, nightly news in the West.
And then Reagan does actually meet ordinary Russians. There's the famous walkabout in Red Square, just outside the Kremlin.
Yeah, this is the defining moment of the visit. Reagan and Gorbachev did a walkabout together in Red Square, surrounded by crowds of curious onlookers. And at one point, a reporter shouts, "Mr. President, do you still think the Soviet Union is an evil empire?" And Reagan replies firmly, "No, I was talking about another time, another era."
And he was right. By the time Reagan left Moscow, it's pretty clear that the Cold War was entering its final chapter.
Yes, in 1989, the following year, communist regimes across the world are beginning to creak towards democracy. Okay, so in China, the leaders cracked down on political protests with ruthless brutality, Tiananmen Square. But in Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe, as reform turns to revolution, Gorbachev chooses not to use force to stop the overthrow of communism. And in November 1981, the Berlin Wall, symbol of Cold War division between East and West, comes down.
And was the Summitry with Reagan a factor in Gorbachev's restraint?
Yeah, I think so. By 1989, the Soviet Union's in a mess. But even so, I think it might have toughed out the next few years and kept up the arms race, whatever the cost. But Gorbachev decides that the new relationship he's forged with the West is more important than clinging on to the Soviet empire. He saw the West now not as an existential enemy, but as a potential partner in building a new world order. And that's down to the summits. If Gorbachev had seen just an old ideologue across the table at those summits at Geneva and Reykjavik and so on, he'd probably have tried to hold on tightly to Eastern Europe. On the other side, Reagan, yes, recognizes that America now has the upper hand, but he doesn't exploit his advantage and drive the Soviets into the ground. He's seeking a peaceful and stable ongoing relationship between their two countries. He's not imagining the Soviet Union is going to collapse in the way it does, and he sees a potential peacemaker in Gorbachev. He reaches out to him. And I would say the president's sort of folksy goodwill, his hopeful idealism, that particular side of him helps to create a new climate in which a superpower showdown becomes unthinkable. It's frankly a rare moment of convergence in international politics. And I think it's made possible, yes, in significant measure by a personal relationship at the top.
So what happened in the years following the summits?
Well, it doesn't quite turn out as Reagan and Gorbachev might have hoped. Gorbachev's reforms unleash a wave of change in the Soviet Union, but that loosening up of the system has unintended consequences. It leads to the end of a one-party communist state and also the increasing breakup of the Soviet Union into separate republics. In 1991, communist hardliners attempt a coup. They're hoping to reverse Gorbachev's reforms. He survives the coup, but it's the beginning of the end of his power. By Christmas 1991, the Soviet Union has dissolved and Gorbachev is out of a job. And he later reflects, "We set out to reform the Soviet Union, but the forces we unleashed were greater than anyone could have imagined."
Yeah. So the Cold War was over, but the world now faced new challenges.
Well, one of the biggest was the rise of nationalism in the former Soviet republics. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to the creation of 15 new states, many of which struggled with ethnic tensions, economic stability, and border wars.
And then there was the question of nuclear weapons there.
Yes, although Reagan and Gorbachev had made significant progress in reducing the nuclear arsenals of the US and Russia, the breakup of the Soviet Union left thousands of nuclear weapons scattered across newly independent states like Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and so on. That's a dangerous situation, and it took years of diplomacy to ensure that those weapons were safely secured.
And the 1990s were a time of chaos and uncertainty in Russia.
Yes, the economy was in a shambles. Many Russians felt humiliated by their loss of superpower status. And Vladimir Putin, who remember had witnessed firsthand the disintegration of East Germany in 1989 when he was a KGB officer in Dresden, he becomes president of Russia at the start of the new millennium. He promises to restore order and national pride, calling the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. A big claim, and we'll come back to Mr. Putin, I think, in a future episode.
Let's end on a more personal note. Despite the challenges, Reagan and Gorbachev did keep in touch in later years.
Yes, they did. Yes. In 1992, Gorbachev visited Reagan at his home in California, and the two men spent hours reminiscing about their time together and reflecting on the changes they'd helped to bring about. And even as Reagan's health declined, he'd now been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and that had gradually robbed him of his memory and his ability to communicate. Even so, Gorbachev kept in touch, and he continued to speak fondly of Reagan.
So looking back over their 4 epic meetings, what do you think we can draw from them? What can we learn from Reagan and Gorbachev's Summitry?
Well, I think above all that Summitry is a process. It requires not only chemistry between leaders, but also sustained work by them, and just as important, by their teams. So Reagan and Gorbachev's success shows how diplomacy, if you like, when it's done imaginatively, boldly and professionally, can help to dissolve even the most entrenched rivalries. But on the other hand, we mustn't go too far. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the subsequent, frankly, tragic history of Russia warns us that deals at the top aren't panaceas. They can't just, in a flash, transform a whole country and set it on a new course. So don't get carried away by the great man theory of history, which I think seduces many leaders at the top.
David, thank you for guiding us through that extraordinary chapter of history. And thank you, listeners, for joining us on Creating History. In our next episode, The Difference a Decade Makes, we'll explore how some of the lessons of the Reagan-Gorbachev era were forgotten in the run-up to the Iraq War of 2003. You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating History. Please rate, review and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. It really helps us get the word out and extend our reach. You can follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram and send us your comments and questions there or by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Also, do check out our first series, Creating Churchill, available wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to buy us or the team a coffee at ko-fi.com, we'd be very grateful. Details of how to donate are in the podcast description. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating History is a Clear Story production.